how quick. I'm a head cook for a senior center, so it depends on how quick we get prep work done on Wednesday.
All right. Well, I just started recording, so now they're hearing about that too. Sorry.
Okay.
I should have waited one more second. But welcome everybody to the meeting. I'm glad it's. I think you'll see it's just tons better if I have like at least 4 or 5, and sometimes we'll have as many as like 20 or 30, which is great. I think, like always, I'll try to cover stuff that I think is particularly hard. We won't have a ton of time, but I think we can get some good stuff done. And then if you have questions, for sure, email me. I know we've had some tricky stuff happen, like some stuff for some people has not worked in the course as far as like submitting things, but I think we've got that all sorted out now, hopefully. So we'll see how that goes. But for sure, if you got questions, email me and let me know. So let me share my screen. And then one thing, if you can, like, mute your mic unless I call on you. Sometimes we'll get like a weird echo or something like that. So just keep that in mind too. But then for sure when I call on you, talk, because it helps. All right, so let's talk about biology. Most of the time people are like, well, why in the world are we doing biology? So try to answer that if you can. Let's go with Kim. What do you think? Why would a psychology class focus an entire week on the biology and particularly the brain?
Well, from what I've sort of learned this week, it's how much the things inside our brain is what kind of is the reaction that we give to a lot of things. Yeah,
good. Right. I mean, there are lots of fields in psychology that sort of say this thing is the cause of why we do what we do. And, to be fair, it's probably all of those things, but biology, it all has to happen here, right? It is going to start and end here, right? And that gets manifest in a lot of ways, and lots of other things in our environment can certainly impact that and do profoundly, but it all starts and ends in our heads with the physiology. So all of our behavior starts there. And what we've found is if we can understand this physiology even better, then it tells us really interesting and important things about ourselves. And I think really helps clarify lots of misconceptions that we have about things like depression, for instance, that we'll talk about a bit about as well. So I try to give you like this, I don't know, it's kind of like a quick and dirty, really oversimplified version of the different structures in our brain, right? We've got thousands and hundreds of thousands of neurons. These are the small cells in our brains that are linked together that we'll talk about at the end today. And when you clump a bunch of them together, they create structures in our brain that are sort of identifiable in different areas in our brain as well. And each area sort of has its own kind of unique thing that it does. We didn't really understand this for a long time. There's kind of a famous case of this guy named Phineas Gage, which is a pretty horrible story. He gets a tamping rod shot through this bottom of his cheek and out the top of his head. Yeah. And that's not good for anybody. But what they realized is he didn't die. That's important because his personality changed dramatically after the incident. Now, for all of us that are much more familiar with like traumatic brain injuries and that kind of a thing, we kind of know, of course, that would change your personality. But at the time, no one really understood that very well. This is like the 1800s. And so they started to then, right? His skull was in the Smithsonian in the US because it's kind of a famous landmark transition where we thought, well, we've got to figure out what these different brain structures do. And they do profoundly different things. So it's kind of cool. So we're going to start with our first brain structure. If you look at this, this is what we call the reptilian brain, which sort of sounds weird because, why in the world we call it the reptilian brain? And the reason is because it's the same, we share that particular thing, that particular type of region with other reptiles. And we kind of like move up the chain of sophistication with our different structures and get closer and closer to primates and then ultimately just us. So we've got this same thing that every other animal, including reptiles, has. And it does a whole lot of things, like controls our breathing and heart rate and all that stuff, which I think is kind of cool. But what I want to do is like teach you the structures of that and what they each do. So the brainstem is an important part. You've probably heard about this. If your brainstem gets damaged, what do you think happens, Sarah?
The brainstem, that's probably where you might lose some of your motor, especially involuntary.
Yeah, I mean, involuntary is definitely right. Not motor so much. If you can see in this brain here, there's a strip we call the motor cortex that runs right along here. And that one, if we ablate certain areas of it or destroy certain parts of it, you'd stop moving or stop feeling, depending on which side of the cortex that we're on and which part exactly. But it's kind of cool. We could map out, like your tongue takes a huge portion from a sensory perspective of that. And of the motor cortex as well, because we need the tongue to do so much stuff. But in this case, you die, which is kind of unfortunate. Now, here's how I remember this. And again, the more you can tie this information to your personal experience, the better. And so that's what I try to do here. And this is kind of a weird story, but when I went to the MTC, there were like 4 guys in our room, and one of the guys was a Marine. Now, I don't know if you've ever had a lot of interactions with Marines, but they're pretty serious about being Marines, even though in this case he was a missionary, but he still sort of felt like he was a Marine. So has anyone ever heard of a K-bar? So any of you 4 happen to know what a K-bar is? Sarah does. A couple people. So Kristen, what's a K-bar?
It's a rations bar, isn't it?
It's a what?
Isn't that the ration bar that they get?
Yeah, no.
No, okay.
No, it's a knife. It's a really long knife. And they kill people with that knife in the Marine Corps. And but I think that's awesome that you're like, oh, it's food. That's what I felt like maybe we should have focused on more. But he practiced killing us with this K-bar, imaginary, of course, in the MTC. And so if you I've learned all this because he's awesome. We call him Elder Psycho. But if you touch the back of your head and follow it down to where your head skull meets your neck, see that little like depression thing right there? He would say, if I stab you with my K-bar right there, then you just collapse and die. And at the time I was like, well, that's creepy, and now I'm never going to sleep. But also, once I learned about the brain, that's where your brainstem connects to your brain. And if we do, in fact, sever that part of your brain, things would stop, like automatic things like breathing and heart rate. So that's how, he would do this all the time. He'd make that sound of him killing us with his K-bar, which again is like indelibly imprinted in my mind now, because I'll never forget that that's how Marines kill people with their knife, and it's also associated with a brainstem. So hopefully now everybody will imagine Elder Psycho in the MTC, deep recesses of the MTC. Imagine some poor missionary me getting pretend but kind of real attacked by an Elder Psycho killing me with his K-bar that was all pretend. But now you'll remember it, right? So I say brainstem, and Miriam, you think what?
Instant death.
That was, even like well stated, right? Cataclysmically stated. Yeah, right. Instant death. Just imagine right there in that part of your brain, and you're done, right? Because it stops that automatic processing of your breathing and your heart rate. Now, to some degree, it's actually really good that we can't think about our heart rate. We don't have to think to make that happen or think to breathe. Because if we had to do that, that would be really bad. Sarah, why?
Well, I was just mentioning this to my daughter while I was reading my chapter yesterday. I said, I'm so glad I don't have to think about breathing and heart rate, or I'd never go to sleep. Because if it had to be a conscious effort, well, the first thing is we'd never sleep to be able to be alive.
Well, and if you think about that,
without sleep, we're going to die anyway.
The second that you thought or forgot to make your heart beat, you would die. So it's kind of a good thing, right? But yeah, no, you're totally right. Just the idea that having to do it, and it gets weird when we think about it too much, right? It kind of does probably makes it harder to sleep. Now, there's cool things that we can do with our heart rate and heart rate monitoring. because there's this thing called biofeedback that we do a lot in clinical psychology, where we hook somebody up to a machine that tells them exactly what their current heart rate, respiration, and galvanic skin response is. And then we teach them relaxation techniques, and they can watch as their heart rate decreases. And it's a powerful, powerful anxiety reducer. And once you get good at it, you don't have to see the numbers in front of you. You can just do it, and your heart rate will decrease. And if your heart rate decreases profoundly and quickly, you get super chill and you relax, and it's great, right? So that's kind of one particularly useful part about kind of seeing it, is that with that biofeedback machine, you can get good at just relaxing yourself at any time that you want to. All right, let's keep going. So we're in the reptilian brain. We got the medulla and the reticular formation, right? So the medulla would probably be that part that's right back here. And the reticular formation, this part right up here, right above it. Medulla does heartbeat and breathing specifically, but the whole brainstem is sort of most known for that. But if you want to get really specific, that's the medulla. And then the reticular formation is what's keeping you guys awake and aroused right now, right? So not sexual arousal at all, but more just awake and functioning, right? So if you're struggling because you didn't sleep last night, then it's your reticular formation that's kind of struggling, if that makes sense. It's what keeps you kind of upright. All right, so let's take a quick break. Tell me, Kristen, what does the medulla do in the brainstem?
The medulla is specifically responsible for the heart beating and breathing.
Good. And you should imagine Elder Psycho killing you right now. Which
No thanks.
Cool. Yeah, classy, right? And the reticular formation, Miriam, it does what?
Keeps me awake listening to you talk today.
Exactly, right? So
and hopefully do my job later.
Say what?
And said hopefully do my job later.
Yeah, hopefully. I always like try to pick on someone in class that's falling asleep, which is sometimes hard, but I teach in the afternoon usually, so most of the time they're nodding off, right? So if I can pick on someone that's falling asleep, they never forget, because I just tell them that their reticular formation's not really functioning at full capacity right now because they're falling asleep, and then they're totally awake, and then later I can say, see, it's working right now. It's working great. All right, so that's our brainstem. Let's move on. Right above the brainstem is this thing called the thalamus. And it kind of looks like almost like a hood that sits right on top of the brainstem. And the thing that it does is it's a sensory switchboard. So sensory information comes in through our sensory inputs, and it gets from here directed to the kind of the right places that it needs to be, right? So if it's vision, if it has anything to do with that, it's going to get directed back here to our occipital lobes. And if it's hearing, it's going to be right here in our temporal lobe, right by our ear. And then motor and sensory information from like the skin is this strip of right back here on our heads. But the thalamus is the thing that takes all that information and sends it where it needs to go. Now, it does all the senses but one sense, and that one sense that it doesn't do is smell. So here is how I remember that one. And that is because, oops, let me go back. If you say thalamus backwards, Sarah, which one's Sarah? Blue shirt. Sarah, what, how do you say thalamus backwards for us?
Let's see, Samaleth.
Yeah, perfect, right? And what it did is it sort of sounds like you're saying smelleth, right?
Ah.
Which is so goofy, stupid, weird, I know.
Okay.
But that's the idea, right? That if we sort of say it backwards, I know it sounded dumb, but it sort of sounds like smell. And that's how I remember, right? That thalamus backwards is smell or smelleth, and it does all the senses but smell. So that's how I remember it. All right, let's do the cerebellum. So this picture would be if you're looking up from your feet, like straight up, the bottom of your brain, it's sometimes called the little brain, and it does coordinated voluntary movement. I don't have like a great way of remembering this one like I do with smell of like the thalamus, but this one I think about a lot because when you drink alcohol, this is the part of your brain that's affected, right? It is impacted by the blood-brain barrier, and the toxins from alcohol get here, and it makes it so that you walk funny. And the coordinated voluntary movements and balance piece, of course, would be kind of messed up, right? If you were drinking alcohol, that's the part that would cause you to be walking funny, to slurring your speech and all that stuff. All right, so let's take another break. Tell me, Kim, what does the medulla do?
I was like concentrating so hard to remember in thalamus and so, the medulla.
Just remember.
That's the one that are involuntary?
It is involuntary stuff, but specifically think elder psycho.
Oh, okay. So the medulla, is that the part that connects to the
Yep. And he would
spinal cord?
try to kill me there. Why?
Instant death?
It does instant death, right? Because it stops the automatic processing that is your
All
heart
the
rate.
things like your heart rate, your breathing, like everything like that.
Good. All right, tell me what the reticular formation does, Kristen.
I'm just taking notes. So it's the it keeps you up, it keeps you awake. Speaking of which, actually, is there a way to stimulate that area of your brain when you haven't had enough sleep besides coffee, obviously?
Yeah. Well, my preferred drug is Mountain Dew. But yeah, no.
You should have been an engineer.
What's that?
You should have been an engineer then.
I know, right?
Yes.
No, there are lots of ways, right? Far more healthy and adaptive than Mountain Dew. It's sort of like exercising, right? So when people exercise at night, for instance, it usually takes them a couple hours to wind down. Like, I like to play pickleball. I know I'm a nerd. But I play pickleball sometimes, and we don't get done till like 10:30 or 11, and forget about sleeping until like 1 or 2 in the morning because I'm so like physiologically awake because of that. So like go outside and don't pull a hammy, but go sprint, like full on sprint, and that'll just jack you up and make you a lot more awake. Good. Tell me about the, let's do the thalamus, Miriam.
The thalamus is kind of like what old-time phones were. They routed all of the information out from the spinal cord, the cerebellum, and everything like that for everything.
Yeah, and it's primarily sensory information. So it's taking stuff right.
Not your nose, though.
Yeah, except for the nose, because that is smell. Well played. All right. And then, Sarah, tell me what the cerebellum does.
The cerebellum, or the little brain, is mostly where it's voluntary sensory.
Not sensory, but
Sensory, but voluntary motion.
There you go. Right, because if you're drunk or high, that's the part of your brain that
gets affected.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good. All right, now we're going to shift gears and get even more specific. We're going to talk about this area that's right above the thalamus and the brainstem, this yellow area. It's called the limbic brain, or the limbic system. Some people call it the mammalian system because it's the same part of the brain that we share with mammals. And it's awesome. It does a lot of things, but primarily what it does is emotions. Some people talk about like being a limbic fighter. So when people get really mad, their heart rate increases past about 120, 115 beats per minute. And when that happens, you are totally in the limbic system, which is not good. How come? Why do you think? Yeah, go. That's Kristen, right?
Yeah, because it could cause you to have a heart attack or go into respiratory distress.
Okay, that's fair. But fairly unlikely if you're young. But if you're like 80, then
Sure.
yeah. But if this limbic system, if you know anything about the brain, you know this front part, the cortex, and especially the frontal and prefrontal cortex, all that stuff is rational, clear, problem-solving kind of place. But if I'm not there, I'm strictly in this emotional place, then by definition, I would be what?
Irrational.
Totally irrational. And you can say and do some really stupid things that your limbic system thinks are really good ideas. But since they're not connected to that rational part of your brain, you can be fairly impulsive and downright even mean. And again, say things that you don't actually mean. But because you're not thinking clearly, you're thinking emotionally and not rationally. That's why you make that mistake.
So this is where teenagers live then?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, kind of, right? So what's cool, teenagers, we know from a mood perspective, they have the highest highs and the lowest lows per age group. But those things all change in an hour, which I think is just kind of interesting and fairly typical of teenagers, right? Like it's totally different in an hour later. But to be fair, all of us do this, right? When any of us get mad enough that we go high heart rate like that, we're stuck right in that limbic system, and we can say and do some totally mean, hurtful things to anybody because we're not thinking clearly at that point. So it sort of behooves us to then slow that down and chill out and quiet us down to get more rational in that point. Let's talk about this because it's kind of cool. All right, so this would be like a side shot of the brain. We got a bunch of structures. Now this is kind of like a ram's horn, if you know what I'm talking about. It's two hemispheres, this side and this side of our brain. And in this case, each side has its own kind of like ram's horn that goes back around. So there's an amygdala on each side, each hemisphere, and there's a hippocampus and there's a hypothalamus as well. So when we look at this, we're going to break this down a little bit. Each one of these matter. So let's talk about the amygdala first. It's this almond-shaped thing, and in Greek it means almond. And what it does is fear and aggression. So if we stimulate this thing, we can make you guys get super crazy mad. Sometimes I'll show this video. We won't have time today, but you should look it up because it's awesome. If you just type in amygdala and bull in YouTube, it should bring up really awesome. And it starts out with, or cat. It starts out, they connect an electrode to the cat's amygdala and they stimulate it, and the cat goes berserk. It starts to like slap its claw on the ground and gets hyper aggressive to the cat, little tiny cute cat next to it. It's crazy. They also do the same thing to a bull in Madrid, Spain. And it's like a bullfight bull, and they stimulate it and the bull goes crazy, and when they turn it off, it like stops its charge. It's a great video because it kind of shows just how powerful when that amygdala is on. We are fear and angry, some kind of combo of that. Right next to the amygdala is this thing called the hippocampus, and it's awesome because it has to do with memories, but memories in particular that are tied to emotions. So here's the way I remember hippocampus. Hippocampus is memory, and what do you do on a campus? Let's do Miriam. On campus, you go and do what?
Make memories.
Yeah, nice touch. You learn and make memories, right? And I think it'd be weird, but if you saw a hippopotamus on campus, would you not remember that?
For sure. If I was on campus. My campus is my house, but
yeah. Even better if a hippopotamus.
If it was at my house, I'd be like, this is awesome.
Yeah, and if hippopotamus they're freaky. They're scary and terrifying. They kill way more people than most other animals in Africa. So you should Google that one because it's terrifying, these hippos that attack. Nonetheless. So don't forget that, right? I say hippocampus, and you think what, Miriam?
Memories, because you would definitely remember a hippo if you saw it.
Yes, good. All right, perfect. So I say medulla, and Kristen, you think what?
Well, you should know I had like 5 hours of sleep, so I have to consult my notes right now. The medulla is it. I always think medulla oblongata, right?
Yeah. From not Tommy Boy, from Waterboy.
Is that what it's from? I just think of actually it's interesting, my association. So the medulla is the heart and breathing piece.
Good. And
medulla oblongata sounds like Hakuna Matata, which is relax and don't worry. So don't worry about keeping breathing and keeping your heart going.
Nice. That's a nice touch. I must have to steal that one. Good. But just remember Elder Psycho trying to kill me while I slept at night, which is really great. The cerebellum, Sarah, does what?
The cerebellum controls voluntary motor.
Yes. And the thalamus, Kim, does what?
The thalamus is your senses.
For
Sends
everything
out-
but
Except for smell.
smell. Sensory switchboard, everything but smell. Perfect. And we didn't do the amygdala, so let's make Miriam do that one. What's the amygdala, Miriam?
So I remember it as Amy G. Dalla, and she's emotional. And so
Nice.
amygdala is for the emotions, for fear and anger.
Amy G. Dalla. Yeah, I love it. Okay, good. Now we're working our way through the limbic system. Our next one's the hypothalamus, which is just right kind of central and above the amygdala. Now this is going to sound inappropriate, but this is how I remember it. It's called the 4 Fs. It does food, fight, flight, and sex. Or fornication, if you want to think about it that way, right? So we got the 4 Fs there. But I swear I never forget it because I think hypothalamus, 4 Fs, food, fight, flight, sex. Got it? Now think about that because that one kind of matters, right? It regulates how much or how little we're eating. There's crazy pictures in your book, I believe in your book, of mice who they stimulate that, and either they're having sex all the time or they're eating all the time. They're like these massively obese mice, because that's the part that does all that, right? It's connected to the pituitary gland, which is right below it, which releases all kinds of hormones, which help us with both our fight and flight system, as well as sex and as well as food. So it's a powerful one, but I just think the 4 Fs and you never forget it. Kristen, yeah. Uh-oh. You're muted. Say that again. You have to unmute.
Thank you. Is the hypothalamus the area of the brain that, for example, a video game programmer would target to stimulate that in order to get someone addicted to a video game? Or is that a different segment and this is really only about eating and sex and emotional regulation?
Yeah. This is kind of like those, there's a pathway, nucleus accumbens, it's near here, and also some dopamine pathways that we'll talk about here in a second, that are more towards addiction for sure. This would be part of it, but this is more like fight or flight kinds of things, and like the energy that comes during sex and before sex and the drive to eat food. It's that kind of like keep you alive kinds of stuff. That makes sense? Great though. It's a great question. There's other more pleasure pathways that are tied to like all addictions in general, just thrive in this dopamine area, right? So when we have addictions, we introduce that chemical into our brain and it mimics a neurotransmitter and hits a very specific region that neurotransmitter is always in. And we call them the dopamine pathways. Also the nucleus accumbens is another area. And those are really important for addiction purposes. But again, like this limbic system, that's the major structures of the limbic system. So we got these 3, right? We got hypothalamus, we got amygdala, we got hippocampus, and they kind of are the big ones that matter. So I say amygdala, Sarah, and that is what?
Okay, the amygdala is the emotion area.
Well, broadly speaking, they're all kind of emotions, but this one is which emotions in particular?
Oh,
Fear and aggression.
okay.
I promise if you find that cat or bull video on YouTube, you'll never
forget it.
It's crazy. Yeah, it's good. The hippocampus, Kim, what's that one?
The emotional memories.
Yeah, good. And we can remember the hippocampus. Why?
If you saw a hippo on campus, you would not forget it.
You would never forget
it would give you an emotion.
Yeah, you'd die. That's good. It's all about death in this one. And then our hypothalamus, Kristen, what's that one?
It's the 4 Fs. So food, flight, fight, and fornication.
Perfect. Well played. I like it. Okay, you guys got it. You're getting it. How about tell me what the medulla does, Miriam?
Well, it's instant death because if you get stabbed in the back by your psycho elder, it stops your breathing in your heart.
And you die immediately. Marines, they're good at it. All right, perfect. Tell me about the cerebellum, Kim.
The cerebellum gives you balance, and it's your voluntary motions.
Perfect. Sarah, the thalamus does what?
That's your sensory switchboard except for smell.
Perfect, because it's smellless backwards. You guys got it. What am I missing? Reticular formation. Tell me about that one, Kristen.
The one that's trying really hard to keep me awake right now.
5 hours of sleep. Now, see, I won't forget you because I'll think 5 hours awake. Yeah, perfect.
Right.
Good.
Say what's the name of that again? The reticular formation?
With an R, reticular formation. Yeah. Okay. So now we've basically gone from the middle out in our brain, if that makes sense, right? We kind of started, if you drill a hole here where that meets, started there, we kind of went outwards. Now we're on this wrinkly portion, right? We know this is called the cortex, but it's awesome. This is the part that makes us unique from other animals, except for our primate cousins. And, but it's all about our ability to solve problems, to think hypothetically, which if you think about that, that's a weird thing, right? Everyone else that's alive in the world, they are very concrete, and their ability to think about stuff, just thinking about it, is really, really limited. Now, this gets us in all kinds of trouble because it can make us think, and this is where I think most people really struggle. We worry what other people think about us, not what they really are thinking, because we can't know that, but just what we think that they think. And that's all hypothetical, right? That's the cognitive basis for depression and anxiety. But it also helps us to organize, plan, and delay gratification, which is super awesome and important. In fact, delaying gratification might be the single most important thing that as a species we do, right? It's the basis of sacrifice, if you think about it. That important law that Heavenly Father gave us to make sacrifices, not just for Him, but we make sacrifices for everything that we do. When we think about like what we do for our families or for our kids or for our friends or for our siblings, and then ultimately the ultimate sacrifice, which is Jesus Christ's atonement, all of that is based on this ability to delay gratification, something that we've got to figure out how to do. And that's all our cortex, which is awesome. So just to wrap up now, I want to talk about the neuron, just really quick, because it's really cool. The neuron, if we go down, is like the smallest part in our brain. And it makes up all these other structures that we've already been talking about. But neurons are crazy. They're crazy awesome. If you think about the number of neurons that we have in our brain, and more specifically, the number of neural connections, all the different connections that they have, there are more neural connections in our brain than there are stars in the entire universe, stars, planets, and everything that we can see. To put it in a more, I think, relevant even context, there are more connections in your brain right now than there are blades of grass and grains of sand in every ocean, in every beach, in every desert, and in every field of grass that you can see. There's way more connections than all of those things combined. So when you think about that, I mean, it's a number so large, the number of connections that we have, that it's almost unfathomable. But it's pretty amazing because lots of really interesting things happen at that neural level. So just really quick, this is what a neuron looks like-ish. And we have these things up top called dendrites, and they connect to other neurons. And then we have these terminal branches, and they also connect to other neurons, but they never actually touch. And this is the important part. Now, we could spend hours on just this thing called the action potential and what that is. But suffice it to say that this neuron, when it communicates with another neuron, has a complex chemical and electrical interaction that makes it sort of quote unquote fire. And as it fires, it sort of like charges the rest of the neuron all the way down here to this terminal branch. When it hits that part, it releases into it's called the synaptic gap, the small microscopic space between the two neurons, one or a couple of a dozen or even 24 different kinds of neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters are where all the action is happening. So if I'm thinking a thought, or I'm feeling a mood, or I'm about to move my arm or talk, all of them involved hundreds of thousands of neural interactions and the releasing and reuptake of all of these neurotransmitters. Now here's the part, and this is what I want to make really relevant. There's one neurotransmitter that does a whole bunch of things, and one of the things that it does is mood. And that neurotransmitter is called serotonin. Now, if you've ever heard about depression medication, there's a depression medication called SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And if you look at this, right, this is the little square and this is the square blown up. Let's say these little molecules, these little neurotransmitters that get released are serotonin. Turns out when you release a whole bunch of serotonin in specific parts of your brain, it makes your mood get better. So I can make you feel less depressed by giving you a drug that makes you release and leave in the synaptic gap more often the neurotransmitter of serotonin. Now, if you look at the name SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, that means that when you release this serotonin, after it's been in the gap for a while, it gets sort of like sucked back up into this dendrite, into this neuron. And if I block some of those reuptake valves, then that means there's going to be more serotonin in that gap. And it takes about 3 to 6 weeks for any kind of medication to work, because it's got to find its way to all those reuptake valves, which there's hundreds of thousands of them, right? They're tiny, and it blocks some of them, selectively blocks some of them. And after 3 to 6 weeks, all of a sudden you've got more serotonin and you feel better. Yeah, Kristen.
Why do some SSRIs have a paradoxical effect in adolescence?
Yeah, super complex.
Okay, you don't have to answer it now. It's
well,
okay.
The truth is we're not exactly sure, other than we've noticed that seems to be a trend. Here's part of why this would probably be the easiest explanation. And I don't want to turn anybody off of medications, because I don't prescribe them, but I'm a full supporter of them. I think the combination of medication and psychotherapy is the best, because it's going to help you get better. What medication does is give you, I think, the energy to think about and work through the problems that you do have to get better. So only if you do both, I think, does it work the best. But to be fair, what happens and this is the best metaphor, imagine a car engine, and there's a tiny space where you want to put the oil, right? Imagine taking like 2-gallon thing of oil and pouring it over the whole car engine. Some of it gets where it needs to go, but it covers the whole engine, which is not good in some ways, right? How come? Because it starts a fire and it's bad for the car, right? Well, that's essentially the same thing you do when you take a medication. That's why most of the medications that you ever hear about, most of the time is spent telling you about all of the what?
Side effects.
Side effects. Because you're basically flooding the entire brain with serotonin, which is not necessarily bad, but creates all kinds of side effects. Some of it gets to the right parts. Most of it goes everywhere else. And that's why there are so many side effects for these drugs. Someday I think we'll figure out, I'm not sure how, but how to get that drug to go to the exact part that we know it needs to get to. But we're not there yet. That's why there's tons and tons of side effects, because it just floods the whole brain with serotonin. And remember, serotonin just doesn't do mood. It does a whole bunch of things. Now, we kind of categorize these neurotransmitters in a bunch of different ways. Like acetylcholine, for instance, does memory. So my mom had dementia, and she took a drug that gave her tons of acetylcholine. She remembered stuff profoundly better, because her brain was not producing enough acetylcholine, or enough acetylcholine wasn't getting the right parts of her brain. And this flooded her whole brain with acetylcholine, helped her remember stuff a lot better. So we've got drugs that do that, but the problem with all of them are that it goes through the whole brain and just floods the whole thing. It's kind of a downer, but it's also pretty cool, right? So when someone says, yeah, I don't think my medication's working, the first question I always ask is, how long have you been on it? Because that drug's got to find its way to thousands and thousands of different reuptake inhibitors to get there. And that takes time. So you got to give it some time for it to start working, 3 to 6 weeks at a minimum. But that's why it happens that way. Now you guys kind of know, right? All right, so we got to wrap it up. But I hope this helps. I think if you use these kinds of little weird tricks, you'll get better at remembering this stuff. And you'll be in a better spot to understand and learn these things and you'll know how to apply them better to your life. So let me see here. I can't make it big again. There we go. All right. So any questions before we wrap up, guys?